The year was 2761, and the galaxy was engulfed in chaos. For millennia, the great species of the cosmos had waged brutal wars across the stars, driven by greed, survival, and expansion. Among them were the Vashtori, an ancient race known for their immense intellect and ruthless efficiency, the Zyrex, a brutal and warlike species who tore apart civilizations for sport, and the Rivarians, a race of seemingly immortal beings that valued power above all else. Together, they formed a coalition known as the Dominion, a ruthless, galaxy-spanning empire that sought to crush any form of resistance. Humanity, a relatively young species, had been dragged into the cosmic war by the overwhelming tide of the Dominion's conquest. The moment Earth's first interstellar transmission was intercepted by the Vashtori, they recognized the potential of the humans. At first, the Dominion sought to use Earth as a strategic outpost, but as humanity began to expand beyond its homeworld, the Dominion realized that this new species, with its resourcefulness and indomitable spirit, would become a true threat if left unchecked. In the Grand Council chambers of the Dominion, an edict was passed: humanity must be neutralized. But what the Dominion failed to understand was that humans, unlike any other species in the galaxy, were capable of fighting in ways no one expected. They weren't just a species of warriors or scholars. They were survivors. And they would not go quietly into the night. On the remote colony of Alneris, the first flicker of human resistance began. Alneris was a backwater mining world in the outskirts of the galaxy, a place that had once been rich with resources but had fallen into poverty as the Dominion's interest waned. The colonists, a mixture of Earth-born citizens and settlers from distant worlds, had lived in peace, unaware of the galactic war raging around them. Until one day, the Vashtori arrived. The Vashtori, led by Commander Verex, a cold and calculating strategist, were dispatched to Alneris to put down a growing rebellion. The colonists had started to resist the Dominion's mining operations, which were siphoning away the planet's natural resources. Verex and his fleet arrived with overwhelming firepower, prepared to crush the rebellion and send a message to any other worlds that might dare to challenge the Dominion. But the humans of Alneris had something the Vashtori hadn't anticipated: desperation, ingenuity, and an unyielding drive to survive. Among them was Captain Elena Harper, a decorated officer in the United Earth Defense Forces. She was stationed on Alneris to oversee the planet's mining operations and had grown attached to the people she had come to protect. When the Dominion fleet appeared in orbit, Harper knew that the time for diplomacy had passed. The Vashtori were here for one thing: to destroy everything. She rallied the colonists, many of whom had no formal military training, and formed a small resistance group. They didn't have the advanced weaponry or tactics of the Dominion forces, but they had something more powerful: adaptability. Using their knowledge of the terrain, the planet's underground tunnels, and the civilian tech at their disposal, they launched guerrilla attacks on the Dominion's troops. They hacked into Dominion supply lines, sabotaged their equipment, and attacked in the dead of night, always staying one step ahead of the Vashtori. Verex was initially confident that this would be another simple mission, until his forces began to suffer unexpected losses. His fleet's ground forces were ambushed, and his reconnaissance drones were disabled, throwing off the Vashtori's precision. The resistance was small, but they were relentless. They had the element of surprise, and most importantly, they fought like they had nothing to lose. Captain Harper, though, was no ordinary leader. Her military experience and strategic mind allowed her to anticipate the Vashtori's moves. She had studied the art of warfare for years and knew how to turn the tide of battle, even with limited resources. One night, under the cover of darkness, Harper and her team launched a daring assault on the Vashtori Command Center, located in the heart of the Dominion's temporary base. The attack was swift and brutal, catching Verex off guard. They stole vital data, including encrypted plans for the Dominion's next move in the war. It was a small victory, but it sent a powerful message across the galaxy: humanity would not fall. Verex, humiliated by the failure, knew he had underestimated the humans. The resistance on Elnaris had awakened something inside him, a rare feeling for the Vashtori, fear. He ordered reinforcements to the planet, but deep down, he knew that this was no longer just a simple mission. It was the beginning of something much larger. Humanity had shown the galaxy that it was capable of fighting back, and the Dominion would have to take notice. Back on Earth, the news of the resistance on Elnaris spread like wildfire. Messages of hope began to emerge from the dark reaches of space, where humanity had once been nothing more than a footnote in the history of the stars. The war for the galaxy had just begun, and humanity, against all odds, was making its mark. The spark of resistance had been lit. Now, the galaxy would watch as humanity forged an unstoppable legacy. The message from Elnaris ignited something deep within humanity. What had begun as a small act of defiance, a handful of humans standing against an oppressive alien force, quickly became a symbol. People across the colonies, Earth, and beyond began to see the resistance not as a futile struggle, but as the beginning of something monumental. The fight for survival had turned into the fight for the future of the galaxy. In the aftermath of their victory, Captain Elena Harper became a hero. Her name spread across the stars, whispered among the oppressed and shouted from the rooftops of cities that had long been under the Dominion's thumb. But while she was celebrated, the reality of their situation began to set in. The Vashtori's failure on Elnaris was only the beginning. They were not going to let humanity's uprising slide. The Dominion would retaliate, and they would come in force. Back at the United Earth Defense Forces, UEDF, headquarters, the High Command had already begun to prepare for the inevitable escalation. The intel that Harper and her team had stolen was invaluable. It revealed a complex, multi-phased plan from the Dominion, an offensive that would involve massive fleets, the raising of planets, and the systematic dismantling of any human resistance. It was a brutal plan, and it was already underway. General Marcus Reed, the head of UEDF, stood before a vast holographic map of the galaxy, outlining the Dominion's next targets. The information provided by the Elnaris resistance had pinpointed several key systems that were next in line for invasion. The Vashtori, enraged by their failure, had already dispatched a fleet of warships to take control of these worlds. The Dominion will not stop, General Reed said gravely. We need to strike first before they can bring their full might down upon us. Harper, having spent weeks analyzing the stolen data with her team, knew that their chances of survival rested on one key factor: speed. The Dominion might have overwhelming resources, but humanity had one advantage: they were unpredictable, agile, and unafraid to fight dirty. We can't just sit here and wait for them to come to us, she argued. We need to take the fight to them. We need to be their nightmare. The strategy was simple yet daring. Harper proposed that humanity launch a series of rapid, surprise strikes against Dominion targets across the galaxy, attacking key supply lines, cutting off reinforcements, and destabilizing the Dominion's hold on critical systems. If humanity could spread the Dominion's resources thin enough, they could buy time to organize a real counteroffensive. It was a gamble, but it was the only option. The UEDF had limited fleets and resources, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in ingenuity. Teams of elite soldiers, many of them former civilians who had joined the resistance after the Elnaris attack, began to form specialized strike groups. Harper's plan involved precision, small but deadly attacks, followed by rapid withdrawals before the Dominion could respond in full force. The goal was not to win every battle, but to send a message: humanity was everywhere, and they were not afraid to fight. As the resistance gathered momentum, a new leader emerged among the stars. Commander Cade Tanaka, once a high-ranking officer in the UEDF, had gone rogue after a botched mission left him with a deep personal vendetta against the Dominion. Tanaka's tactics were brutal, bordering on the edge of madness, but they were effective. His reputation as a war criminal of sorts had earned him both admiration and fear, and now, with the galaxy watching, he sought to unite the disparate human factions into a cohesive force. Tanaka's first mission was a daring assault on the Vashtori's flagship, the Omnis, which had been stationed in the outer reaches of the Celeris system. The ship was one of the largest in the Dominion fleet, capable of destroying entire fleets with a single shot from its massive energy cannon. Its destruction would send a powerful message to the Dominion, a signal that humanity was ready to challenge even the most formidable enemies in the galaxy. The plan was reckless, but Tanaka believed that humanity's survival depended on taking risks. He gathered a squadron of the best pilots and warriors, including Harper, and embarked on a covert mission to infiltrate the flagship. The assault team was to use a stolen Dominion stealth cruiser to get close enough to the Omnis without detection, board it, and plant explosives in its critical systems. The mission was a high-stakes gamble, but as the small fleet approached the massive warship, it became clear that they had the element of surprise. The Dominion hadn't expected such a bold move. In the dead of space, under the shadow of the Omnis, the humans launched their attack. It was a coordinated strike. The stealth cruiser launched torpedoes to cripple the ship's external defenses, while the strike team boarded the vessel from multiple points, infiltrating its corridors like shadows in the dark. What followed was pure chaos. The humans fought their way through the heavily armed Vashtori guards, planting explosives at critical junctures. Every move was calculated, every step taken with the knowledge that failure meant annihilation. And yet, despite the odds, the humans pressed on, driven by the same indomitable spirit that had seen them survive for centuries. Just as the mission seemed on the verge of failure, with the Dominion forces closing in, Harper managed to plant the final explosive in the heart of the Omnis's engine core. The blast that followed was so powerful that it rocked the entire system, sending a shockwave that could be seen for light years. The Omnis was destroyed. The message was clear: humanity would not be crushed. As the remnants of the human strike force made their way back to their fleet, they knew that this victory was just the beginning. They had drawn blood. And the Dominion was not going to take it lightly. The galaxy had begun to change. And in the heart of the cosmic war, humanity had forged an unstoppable legacy. The victory at the Celeris system sent ripples across the galaxy. The destruction of the Omnis, the jewel of the Vashtori fleet, shook the Dominion to its core. The message was unmistakable: humanity, the so-called young and primitive species, had just dealt a critical blow to the most powerful empire in the galaxy. The news spread like wildfire through both the Dominion and the human resistance, each side reeling from the implications. But while humanity celebrated their hard-won triumph, the Dominion began to regroup, preparing for the inevitable retaliation. The Vashtori were not known for their mercy, and Commander Varix's humiliation at the hands of the human resistance would not go unpunished. The Dominion's leaders convened in secret to devise a counterstrike that would not only avenge the loss of the Omnis but also crush the growing human resistance before it could gain further momentum. Back on Earth, General Marcus Reed knew that humanity's success on Celeris was fleeting. They had struck a critical blow, yes, but the Dominion would come back with even greater force. The strike teams that had launched the daring mission to destroy the Omnis had returned, battle-worn but emboldened. Yet, despite their newfound confidence, they were all too aware of the gravity of the situation. They were now on the Dominion's radar in ways they hadn't been before, and the stakes were about to rise. "This is just the beginning," General Reed said, his voice filled with the weight of the situation. "We've proven we can hit them where it hurts, but we've also painted a target on our backs." Captain Elena Harper stood beside him, her face reflecting the same concern. "We can't back down now. They'll come for us, sure. But we need to stay one step ahead. The more they chase us, the more mistakes they'll make. We have to keep pushing." Reed nodded. "But this next phase will be different. We need to prepare for a full-scale war." As the Dominion ramped up its offensive, they called upon the Zyrex, a brutal race of genetically modified soldiers with a singular focus: extermination. The Zyrex were savage, powerful, and without mercy. When the Dominion mobilized them, it was a signal that they were no longer simply trying to control humanity. They were coming to annihilate it. These war beasts, known for their relentless aggression, were now tasked with eradicating the human threat once and for all. Meanwhile, the resistance, despite their small numbers, began to rally. Harper's strategy, which had focused on quick strikes and guerrilla tactics, had gained the attention of every human settlement across the galaxy. The resistance was growing, fueled by the fire of victory and the promise of freedom from the Dominion's tyranny. The human colonies, previously isolated and fragmented, were beginning to unite under a single banner. However, they still lacked the resources, manpower, and firepower to face the Dominion head-on. That was when Cade Tanaka reappeared, unannounced and seemingly out of nowhere. Tanaka, the rogue commander with a personal vendetta against the Dominion, had gone underground after the destruction of the Omnis. His methods were unorthodox, but his results were undeniable. He had been operating on the fringes of the resistance, leading small, highly effective sabotage operations that crippled Dominion supply chains and logistics. His style of warfare was brutal, yet it worked. Tanaka's return marked a turning point for the human resistance. He brought with him not just his own forces, but an underground network of mercenaries, rogue factions, and defectors from Dominion-occupied worlds. Tanaka had a singular vision: the destruction of the Dominion's infrastructure. He understood that as long as the Dominion supply lines were intact, they would continue to overwhelm humanity with their sheer might. To win, they needed to starve the Dominion of the resources it needed to wage war. Under his guidance, the resistance began to focus on disrupting Dominion supply lines across the galaxy, destroying factories, stealing critical raw materials, and sabotaging weapons shipments. This new phase of the war was different from anything they had done before. It was more than just fighting, it was a calculated, strategic campaign to bleed the Dominion dry. However, as the resistance took bolder steps, they were met with increasing retaliation. The Zyrex, now deployed in the front line of the Dominion's war effort, began hunting down the resistance with terrifying efficiency. These monstrous soldiers were not only skilled in combat, they were brutal trackers, capable of picking up the faintest trail left by the humans. Their arrival on any battlefield was heralded by chaos and destruction. One such battle took place on the rocky moon of Helios, a strategic outpost that had been seized by the resistance. Harper and her team had successfully infiltrated the moon's defenses, setting up traps and ambushes for the Dominion's inevitable arrival. But they had underestimated the Zyrex. The Zyrex attacked without warning, swarming the resistance's position with terrifying speed. In the blink of an eye, they tore through the human defenses, using advanced cloaking technology and their sheer brute strength to crush any resistance. Harper's squad, caught in the chaos, fought valiantly, but the odds were overwhelming. Just when it seemed the battle would be lost, reinforcements from Tanaka's mercenary group arrived, turning the tide. The battle on Helios was a costly victory, but it revealed the true nature of the Zyrex threat. These creatures were not just soldiers, they were an existential danger to humanity's survival. "This is just the beginning," Harper muttered as she looked over the battlefield, littered with the bodies of both human and Zyrex soldiers. "We've got to be smarter. We can't keep throwing ourselves at them and expecting to win." Tanaka, ever the strategist, saw the bigger picture. "We hit them where it hurts. We bleed them dry. And when they come to crush us, we'll make them pay." But the Dominion had become aware of this new human strategy. As humanity's attacks on their infrastructure intensified, the Dominion began to tighten their grip. Their forces were being stretched thin, but their resolve remained unshaken. Commander Varix, humiliated once more, would stop at nothing to ensure humanity's destruction. The war was escalating, and humanity had no choice but to fight on. But one thing was certain: in the shadows of retaliation, humanity was beginning to forge a legacy of its own. A legacy of resistance, of survival, and of a determination to defy the impossible.
The war had reached a critical juncture. Humanity, despite their relentless efforts, was fighting on the edge of extinction. Every victory was met with swift and brutal retaliation from the Dominion. The Vashtori, furious at their earlier failures, launched counteroffensives that shook the foundation of human resistance. The Xyrex, relentless and unforgiving, were hunting the scattered remnants of human forces, clearing entire systems of any signs of rebellion. But amidst the chaos, something remarkable began to happen. The human resistance, once a disjointed collection of independent groups, had started to evolve into a formidable fighting force. Commanders like Elena Harper, Cade Tanaka, and General Marcus Reed were no longer isolated leaders but symbols of unity. Their success on the battlefield, coupled with their unwavering resolve, had sparked an unprecedented wave of recruitment. Millions of civilians, inspired by the stories of daring raids and victorious strikes, volunteered to join the cause. Still, the odds were insurmountable. The Dominion had established a stranglehold on the galaxy, occupying world after world, suppressing any whispers of rebellion with overwhelming force. The human resistance, though united, was spread thin, stretched across the far-flung corners of the galaxy. Their supply lines were frail, their fleets dwindling, and the Dominion's grip seemed unbreakable. It was in this dire moment that a plan was conceived, a final, desperate gambit that could either break the Dominion's power or seal humanity's doom. The human resistance had learned something in the past year of fighting. The Dominion's strength lay not just in its military might, but in its centralized command structure. The Dominion's leaders, spread across various systems, controlled vast armies and fleets with unparalleled coordination. But they were not invulnerable. There was one target that could cripple the Dominion's entire war effort, a target so dangerous, so critical, that if it fell, the Dominion would lose its ability to function. The Vashtori had constructed a facility hidden deep in the heart of the Voria system, a facility known only to a few at the highest levels of the Dominion. It was a massive data repository, containing the Dominion's most sensitive military intelligence, fleet coordination, and the personal identities of every high-ranking officer in the Dominion. It was the center of the Dominion's war effort, the nerve center from which they coordinated their galactic conquest. If humanity could destroy that facility, it would fracture the Dominion's ability to wage war. Harper and Tanaka, after months of planning, finally agreed to take the mission. They had learned one thing from their constant skirmishes with the Dominion: they couldn't win by conventional means. The only way forward was a direct, heart-stopping strike at the core of their enemy's power. The mission was to be an all-or-nothing operation. With the majority of the Dominion's fleet tied up in ongoing campaigns, the Resistance had a window of opportunity. However, it was a narrow window. The Voria system was heavily guarded by both Vashtori and Xyrex forces, and its defenses were second to none. To stand a chance, the Resistance would need to infiltrate the facility covertly, plant a set of powerful explosives in its core, and escape before the Dominion could retaliate. Failure would mean certain death for every soul involved, and the end of humanity's hope. On the eve of the mission, as the final preparations were being made, a solemn atmosphere hung over the Resistance fleet. The usual optimism had been replaced by a palpable tension. Everyone knew that this was a one-way trip. Few were expected to return. And yet, in the faces of the soldiers, there was no fear, only determination. "Are you ready for this?" Harper asked Tanaka as they stood together, overlooking the fleet assembled in the hangar bay. Tanaka's expression was unreadable. "No. But it's the only choice we have." General Reed approached them, his eyes hardened with the weight of command. "This mission has one goal: destroy the facility, break the Dominion's command structure. Without that facility, the Dominion will lose its coordination. Their fleets will scatter, their armies will be leaderless. This is the turning point we've been waiting for." Harper nodded, though her mind was clouded with doubt. "If this doesn't work—" "We don't think like that," Tanaka interrupted, his voice sharp. "We think about what happens if it does. This is our chance to end the war." The Resistance fleet, a ragtag group of converted civilian ships, warships, and stolen Dominion technology, gathered their forces and set course for the Voria system. The journey was a tense one, the silence aboard each ship broken only by the hum of engines and the occasional whispered prayer. As they neared their target, the enormity of the task ahead became clear. The Voria system was a fortress, surrounded by dozens of Dominion ships, each one prepared to defend the data facility with everything it had. But the humans were prepared to fight with everything they had too. The mission began with precision. Stealth ships, piloted by the best of the Resistance's elite forces, infiltrated the system, dodging Dominion patrols and skimming past the most heavily fortified areas. They would strike fast, hitting the facility before the Dominion could mount a defense. The first phase of the mission involved neutralizing the outer defenses of the facility, a task that would fall to Tanaka and his mercenary group. Tanaka's plan was ruthless but brilliant. Using a combination of hit-and-run tactics and cyber warfare, his forces disabled the facility's outer defenses in a series of coordinated attacks. The Dominion, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, but by the time they realized what was happening, the core of the Resistance forces had already arrived. Captain Harper, leading the charge, pushed her team through the facility's labyrinthine corridors. They fought their way deeper into the heart of the facility, their boots echoing on the metal floors as they encountered wave after wave of Dominion defenders. Each skirmish was brutal, each step forward bought with blood. But then, as they neared the facility's core, a new threat emerged. The Zyrex were on the ground. And they were coming for the humans with a fury unmatched by any enemy they had faced before. The final battle for the Voria facility had begun, and humanity's fate now rested on the strength of its resistance, and the will of those who refused to give up. The battle for the Voria facility raged on with a savage intensity that no one had anticipated. The Resistance forces, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a desperation born of the realization that this mission was their last, best hope. Harper, Tanaka, and their teams pressed deeper into the heart of the facility, pushing through wave after wave of Dominion soldiers and their deadly Zyrex counterparts. Every corridor, every room became a battleground. The air was thick with smoke, and the sound of blasters and explosions reverberated throughout the metal hallways. Harper's heart pounded in her chest as she led the charge. Her once steady hand trembled with the weight of their mission. There was no turning back. If they didn't succeed, humanity would lose everything. She glanced back at her team, her eyes meeting those of her soldiers. They were all driven by the same unspoken understanding: victory was the only option. The Zyrex had arrived, and their presence on the battlefield was like a dark omen. The genetically enhanced warriors tore through the human resistance with terrifying ease. Even the most experienced fighters in Harper's squad struggled to hold their ground against the sheer power and brutality of the Zyrex. Every one of these beasts was a force of nature, immense, fast, and relentless. And the resistance was running out of time. "Keep moving!" Harper shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "The core is just ahead. We can't afford to stop." Tanaka, leading his mercenaries, had managed to disable the external defenses of the facility, but that had only opened the door for the Dominion's most dangerous forces to pour in. As Harper and her team advanced, they encountered more resistance, but they had only one objective in mind: the core of the facility, where the Dominion's command center resided. The explosives they carried would destabilize the facility and cripple the Dominion's ability to wage war, but they had to plant them inside the heart of the facility, beneath layers of armor and security systems. As they neared their destination, the Zyrex seemed to sense their approach. A massive figure appeared at the end of the hallway, one of the Zyrex commanders, towering over the humans with his monstrous form. He roared, his voice like thunder, and charged at them with terrifying speed. "Take him down," Tanaka ordered, his voice cold and commanding. The mercenaries opened fire, but the Zyrex commander seemed almost impervious to their weapons. He barreled through their lines, throwing men aside like ragdolls, his claws swiping through the air with deadly precision. Harper didn't hesitate. She moved toward the commander, her pulse racing, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. She had no choice but to confront this beast head-on. She raised her blaster and fired, the shots striking the Zyrex commander's chest, but they did little to slow him down. He growled, turning his gaze toward her, and with a swift motion, he lunged at her. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Harper's mind raced, but instinct kicked in. She dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the commander's deadly claws as they tore through the air where she had just stood. Rolling to her feet, she didn't stop to think. She pulled out a thermal detonator, a last-ditch weapon designed to cause maximum damage, and hurled it directly at the Zyrex. The explosion rocked the facility, but it wasn't enough to take down the commander. He was still standing, bloodied but undeterred. Harper could see the rage in his eyes, the hatred of a species bred for nothing but destruction. She wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out, but she knew one thing for certain: they couldn't let the mission fail. "Fall back!" Tanaka shouted as he fired his weapon into the advancing Zyrex forces. "We need to reach the core now." The resistance fought tooth and nail, struggling to keep the Zyrex at bay as they made their final push toward the facility's central control room. The mission was slipping through their fingers, but the core was within sight. They could do this. But just as they reached the door to the heart of the facility, the Dominion unleashed its final trump card. A massive blast erupted from the ceiling, knocking Harper and her team to the ground. The walls trembled as if the facility itself were in its death throes. The blast had been a last-ditch effort to seal them in. "Get up!" Tanaka shouted, pulling Harper to her feet. "The core's right there." They couldn't afford to waste any time. Tanaka and his mercenaries pushed forward, covering their retreating comrades as they made their way into the control room. Harper, heart in her throat, quickly set to work planting the explosives at key structural points in the core. Every second counted. The Zyrex and Dominion forces were closing in, and the room was filled with the sound of battle outside. The countdown on her detonator began, ticking down the final moments of their mission. The pressure was suffocating, but Harper kept her focus. They had come too far. They couldn't let it all fall apart now. With the charges set and the escape plan in motion, Harper gave the signal. "We're done here. Fall back." The retreat was chaotic. Explosions rocked the facility as the resistance made their way out, fighting their way back through the corridors. The Zyrex were relentless, and the Dominion forces had begun to flood the area. The odds seemed insurmountable. But the resistance kept fighting, drawing strength from the knowledge that the core was rigged to explode, that they had done what they came to do. As they made their way back to the hangar bay, Tanaka called in the remaining ships to extract them. The ground shook as the countdown hit its final moments. "We're not going to make it out in time," Harper said, a bitter realization settling in. The facility was collapsing, and the explosion would tear everything apart. "We don't need to," Tanaka replied grimly. "Just get to the ship." And then, with a deafening roar that could be heard across the entire Voria system, the facility exploded. The shockwave sent the remaining Dominion forces into disarray. For a moment, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath as the Resistance's final blow shattered the heart of the Dominion's war machine. But as the Resistance fleet made their escape, the cost of their victory became clear. The battle had taken a heavy toll. Lives had been lost. Men and women who had given everything for the cause of freedom were now gone. And as the survivors drifted away from the smoldering remains of the Voria facility, they knew this war was far from over. The Dominion would retaliate. But humanity had proven it could strike back, hard. Their legacy was sealed in blood and sacrifice. And though the path ahead was uncertain, humanity would continue to fight. Because as long as they had breath in their lungs, they would never stop. The days following the destruction of the Voria facility were a whirlwind of chaos and survival. The human resistance fleet, battered and broken, limped through the galaxy in a state of exhaustion. The operation that had been meant to cripple the Dominion's command structure had succeeded, but at a cost. With their core facility destroyed, the Dominion's communications and logistics were thrown into disarray. But the price had been steep. A quarter of the Resistance's forces had been lost, including some of their most experienced commanders. The human race had struck a blow that could change the course of the war, but they had paid a heavy price for it. On the bridge of the Ardent Star, the flagship of the human resistance, General Marcus Reed stood in front of a holographic map of the galaxy. His face was drawn with fatigue, but his eyes were sharp. Despite the success of the mission, the weight of what had been lost was evident in his posture. The Dominion was reeling, yes, but they were far from defeated. Their warships still outnumbered the Resistance's by the thousands. Their colonies, although destabilized, were still firmly under their control. The human resistance might have struck a blow to the heart of the Dominion, but they were still far from winning the war. "Status report," Reed said, his voice low but resolute. Captain Elena Harper, who had returned from the mission battered and bruised, stepped forward, her expression grave. "We've successfully crippled their command structure, but the Dominion has begun redirecting its resources. They're scrambling to restore their communications, and we're getting reports of massive fleet movements. They're not retreating, they're regrouping for a counteroffensive." Reed's face tightened, his jaw clenching. "I was afraid of that. They'll come for us with everything they have." Harper nodded. "And they'll be looking to make an example of us." The destruction of the Voria facility was humiliating for them. "We've got to be ready for what's coming." Reed turned to face the map, his mind racing. The Dominion wouldn't let a single loss slide. They would retaliate with a ferocity that humanity had never encountered. Their next move would be calculated, precise, and deadly. The Resistance couldn't afford to wait. They needed to act, and fast, before the Dominion could mount a full-scale counteroffensive. "We've lost too many ships and too many soldiers to stand toe-to-toe with their fleets," Reed muttered. "But we've got one thing they don't." Harper raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Reed's eyes flicked to her. "We've got hope. And we've got the element of surprise. We've spent years hiding in the shadows. We've been underestimated. Now, it's time to turn the tables." Over the next few days, the human resistance worked furiously to rebuild. Supplies were scarce, and many of their fleet's ships were too damaged to continue. But the loss of the Voria facility had sent ripples through the Dominion's ranks. While their enemies regrouped, the Resistance capitalized on the chaos, hitting Dominion outposts and supply lines where they were weakest. Small, surgical strikes became their strategy, and each one built their momentum. However, the Dominion was far from paralyzed. The Dominion High Command had mobilized a fleet unlike anything the Resistance had ever seen. It was a massive armada, composed of their finest warships and elite forces. Varix, the Vashtori commander who had once been humiliated by the Resistance's victory at Celeris, was now in charge of leading the counteroffensive. His anger and thirst for vengeance were palpable, and he would stop at nothing to crush the humans once and for all. "We've been too lenient," Varix growled to his subordinates as he surveyed the vast fleet he had assembled. "The humans have tasted victory, and they think they're invincible. We will show them what happens when they defy the Dominion." His fleet was vast, so much so that even the human resistance, with all its guerrilla tactics and surprising victories, knew they stood little chance in direct confrontation. Varix's armada dwarfed anything the Resistance had ever mustered. It was a fleet built for domination, and its primary target was clear: Earth. The birthplace of humanity, the symbolic heart of the rebellion, would be eradicated once and for all. On Earth, General Reed stood before the command center, his face hardened. The planet's defenses were strong, but not strong enough to withstand the full might of the Dominion. He knew what was coming. The Resistance had no hope of defeating Varix's fleet head-on. "We need to fight smarter, not harder," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "We need to hit them where it hurts." Captain Harper entered the room, her voice sharp with urgency. "We've got something. Intelligence reports indicate the Dominion fleet will pass through the Oort belt before heading for Earth. We have one shot at this." Reed looked up, meeting her gaze. "One shot? You're sure?" Harper nodded. "It's risky. But it's our only chance. If we can ambush their fleet in the Oort belt, we can cripple their advance and buy Earth the time it needs to prepare for their assault." Reed stood, his mind racing. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only one they had. "Then we do it. We hit them hard, hit them fast, and we don't give them time to recover." The Resistance immediately began to assemble their forces. It was a last-ditch effort, a desperate move that could either turn the tide of the war or seal their fate. The fleet they were preparing was small, nothing compared to the Dominion Armada, but it was fast, agile, and equipped with the best technology humanity could muster. Their goal wasn't to win the battle, it was to make sure the Dominion couldn't win the war. As the human fleet moved toward the Oort Belt, there was a palpable tension in the air. Every soldier, every pilot, knew what was at stake. This was it, their last chance. If they failed, Earth would fall, and humanity's legacy would be reduced to ashes. But if they succeeded, they would deal a blow so crippling to the Dominion that it would echo across the galaxy for generations. It was the rise of humanity's final stand, their phoenix moment. The fire of rebellion was burning hotter than ever, and they would fight, not just for survival, but for the future of their species. Against all odds, they would rise. The Oort Belt loomed ahead, a cold and distant expanse that had long been considered a barren, empty region at the edge of the solar system. But for the human resistance, it was now the stage for a battle that would determine the future of humanity. General Reed stood on the bridge of the ardent star, his gaze fixed on the star-filled void ahead. The fleet was small, too small, but it was all they had left. A dozen ships, each one filled with brave men and women who had volunteered for the most dangerous mission of their lives. The Dominion fleet was incoming, and they had to strike fast, hard, and without hesitation. "Status?" Reed asked, his voice low, his tone steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Harper, standing at his side, looked over her tactical console. "We've got them, General. The Dominion fleet is in position. They're about to enter the Oort Belt. The plan is in motion." Reed nodded, glancing at the holographic projection of the Dominion Armada, a vast and terrifying sight. It was a force unlike any the humans had ever encountered, a fleet built for total domination, with hundreds of ships, from massive warships to countless smaller cruisers and assault vessels. But Reed knew the plan was the only chance they had. The Dominion had become too complacent in its power. They thought they could crush the humans like a bug. It was time to prove them wrong. "This is it," Reed said, his voice resolute. "On my mark, we strike." The fleet was scattered across the outer reaches of the Oort Belt, hidden among the asteroids and icy comets. The Resistance had set up a series of strategically placed ambush points, using the rocky terrain to their advantage. Their goal was not to engage the Dominion head-on, but to disrupt their communications, disable their flagship, and sow confusion in their ranks long enough to make Earth's defense viable. The Ardent Star and its sister ships were outfitted with the latest in stealth technology and powerful EMP weapons, tools designed to hit the Dominion fleet where it hurt the most, their reliance on centralized command and communication systems. If they could sever those connections, they would break the fleet's coordination and send it into disarray. A disorganized fleet was a vulnerable fleet, and that was the opening the Resistance needed. A deep silence settled over the command room as Reed gave the order. Now. With precision and deadly efficiency, the fleet sprang into action. Ships darted out of their hiding places, emerging from behind massive asteroids and comet clusters. The Dominion fleet, caught off guard by the sudden appearance of the Resistance forces, scrambled to respond. The first wave of attack was aimed at the fleet's communication satellites, sending a wave of EMP pulses through the air and disrupting their systems. The Dominion ships began to panic, their coordinated formations breaking apart as they struggled to regain control. The first blood was drawn, the Ardent Star unleashed a barrage of missiles at a command cruiser, striking it with a precise hit that crippled its propulsion. The ship drifted helplessly, its crew in disarray. "Keep them off balance," Reed ordered. "Focus on the command ships." The human fleet pressed the attack, using their speed and surprise to strike where the Dominion was weakest. A group of smaller, faster Resistance ships swooped in on one of the Dominion's largest warships, the Acorus, a monstrous vessel that had been the symbol of the Dominion's might. It was the flagship of Varix's fleet. The plan was to disable it, to take out the heart of the Dominion's command structure. Captain Harper, leading the charge, guided her ship through a storm of debris, expertly maneuvering between asteroids and scattered wreckage. "We're in position. Ready to board," she reported. "We'll take it from here." Reed's voice crackled through the comms. "Be careful, Elena. That ship is crawling with Zyrex." "Don't worry, sir," she replied with a grim smile. "We've faced worse." As the resistance ships closed in on the Icarus, a series of explosions erupted from the Dominion fleet. The humans had taken down enough of the communication satellites to completely cripple the enemy's command structure. For the first time in years, the Dominion fleet was blind, unable to coordinate its next moves. Ships collided with each other as confusion spread like wildfire. Meanwhile, aboard the Icarus, Harper and her boarding team stormed the flagship's command center. The Zyrex guards, massive and powerful, rushed to intercept them, but the humans were ready. Explosions and gunfire filled the air as resistance fighters engaged in brutal, hand-to-hand combat with the alien warriors. Harper's team fought with everything they had, fighting not just for survival, but for the future of humanity. Harper herself fought her way through the chaos, her blaster in hand, her focus unwavering. She was heading straight for the command deck. The Zyrex were everywhere, but Harper's team cut through them like a blade through paper, every member driven by the same single-minded purpose: to end this war. Finally, Harper reached the heart of the ship. Varix himself stood at the command console, snarling as he watched the chaos unfold. The Vashtori commander had been expecting victory. He had been expecting to destroy humanity, to wipe them from existence. Now, it was he who was trapped in his own ship, his fleet in disarray. "You think you've won, human?" Varix's voice echoed across the command room. Harper raised her blaster, her voice calm but firm. "This is the end for you, Varix." Without hesitation, she fired. The explosion was deafening as the command deck erupted in flames. The Icarus trembled, its systems failing one by one. But Harper didn't wait to watch the destruction unfold. She turned on her heel and raced toward the exit. The ship was falling apart, and time was running out. Back in the Oort Belt, the human fleet had completed their mission. The Dominion's flagship was in ruins, and their communications were down. The remaining ships, confused and leaderless, were now ripe for destruction. The Resistance moved in, striking with precision to eliminate any remaining threats. The tide of the battle was shifting, but the war was far from over. As the human fleet gathered together, battered but victorious, Reed looked out at the remnants of the Dominion's armada. The odds had been impossible, but humanity had overcome them. They had done the impossible. And as the survivors of the final battle regrouped, one thought echoed through the minds of all those who had fought, bled, and sacrificed. Humanity had forged an unstoppable legacy. And now, the future was theirs to shape.